In the villages of Eastern Europe, death did not arrive as a clean conclusion. It lingered, hovered, waited. Long after the final breath left the body and the earth was packed tight above the coffin, something remained unsettled, an echo that refused to be quiet. The land itself seemed to remember those who had been lowered into it, and sometimes it answered back. These were places shaped by forests and fog, by winters that swallowed sound and summers that rotted grain in the fields. Life unfolded close to the soil, and so did death. Graves were shallow, prayers were fragile, and memory pressed heavily against the living. To bury someone was not to dismiss them from the world, but to renegotiate their place within it. The dead were still near. They were still listening. When misfortune followed a funeral, when milk soured overnight, when livestock collapsed without warning, when children wasted away beneath unseen fevers, the villagers searched not the sky but the ground. They believed the earth had been disturbed, offended, or improperly sealed. Somewhere beneath their feet something was wrong. This was the world that gave rise to the Strigoi. Before the word existed, before folklore sharpened its edges, there was only a fear without language. The fear that death could fail. That a soul might not depart cleanly. That the body, though buried, could remain active in unseen ways. In these communities, shaped by Orthodox Christianity layered over older pagan cosmologies, the dead occupied a dangerous middle ground. They were no longer human, but not yet safely distant. Burial was therefore a ritual of precision and anxiety. The body had to be prepared correctly, placed correctly, mourned correctly. Any deviation risked catastrophe. A knot tied the wrong way. Prayer spoken too softly. A grave dug too shallow in frozen ground. Even the moral life of the deceased mattered. Those who lived dishonorably were believed to die imperfectly. Death here was a test, and many feared it could be failed. When graves were reopened, sometimes days, sometimes weeks after burial, the evidence seemed undeniable. Bodies were found swollen, flushed, and strangely intact. The skin stretched tight, the face ruddy, the mouth darkened with fluid. To the modern eye, these were signs of natural decomposition. Gases building within the corpse, blood pooling where gravity pulled it, tissues breaking down in predictable patterns. But medieval villagers did not have this language. They did not know the body's final chemistry. They only knew what they saw. And what they saw appeared to be life. The dead looked fed. They looked warm. They looked as if they had moved. From this terror emerged a name, Strigoi. A word rooted in ancient Latin and Slavic fragments, echoing meanings of screeching spirits and nocturnal unrest. The Strigoi was not yet the vampire of fiction. It did not stalk castles or seduce victims beneath moonlight. It remained bound to the grave, to the village, to the familiar. Its presence was felt through absence, through illness, through decay, through the quiet unraveling of daily life. The Strigoi did not hunt, haunted. What mattered most was not what the Strigoi did, but why it existed. It was believed that certain deaths left the soul incomplete. Those who died suddenly, violently, or without proper rites were especially dangerous. So too were the unbaptized, the illegitimate, the socially marginal. In life, these people existed at the edges of the community. In death, they were believed to linger there as well, unsettled, resentful, unfinished. The Strigoi became a vessel for communal guilt. When famine struck or disease spread, the living searched for a cause that could be confronted. Illness was invisible. Weather was indifferent. But the dead could be exhumed. They could be accused. They could be corrected. In this way, the Strigoi offered something rare in a world of uncertainty. An enemy that could be named and addressed. Fear hardened into ritual. Villagers developed protective customs. Iron nails driven into coffins, seeds scattered around graves to distract the restless dead, thorny branches laid across burial sites to prevent movement. These were not acts of cruelty, but of desperate containment. Each ritual was a sentence spoken against chaos, a declaration that death would remain obedient. Yet even as these measures multiplied, the fear persisted. Because the Strigoi was not truly about corpses. It was about control. In societies where medicine was limited and life was precarious, death represented not just loss but vulnerability. A single burial gone wrong could threaten the entire village. The Strigoi embodied the anxiety that nothing, not even death, was predictable. That the boundary between the known and the unknowable was thin, porous, and easily breached. Psychologically, the Strigoi functioned as an explanation for grief that had nowhere else to go. Sudden death left survivors searching for meaning. Unexplained illness demanded narrative. The Strigoi gave suffering a story, and stories, unlike randomness, can be endured. Anthropologically, these beliefs reveal a culture negotiating the transition between pagan cosmology and Christian doctrine. The Church taught resurrection at the end of days, but folk memory remembered spirits who lingered too long. The Strigoi occupied this unresolved space, a reminder that belief systems do not replace one another cleanly. They layer, overlap, and sometimes contradict. The dead in this worldview were not passive. They were participants in the moral economy of the village. A good death preserved harmony. A bad one destabilized it. Thus, the fear of becoming Strigoi shaped behavior in life as much as in death. To live well was to ensure rest. To die correctly was a final obligation to the community. Over time, the image would sharpen. Later centuries would add hunger, intent, and predation. Blood would become symbolic. Teeth would grow longer in story. But here at the beginning, the Strigoi was not a monster in the modern sense. It was a warning. A reminder that death required care. That memory mattered. That forgetting or burying improperly had consequences. Even today, long after science has explained decay and decomposition, the unease remains. Graves still carry weight. Silence around the dead still feels fragile. The Strigoi no longer rises from the soil, but it lingers in the imagination, a fossilized fear embedded in folklore. It whispers that endings are not always endings, and that sometimes what we fear most is not the dead returning, but the possibility that they were never truly allowed to leave. In the medieval imagination, death was not a door that closed. It was a membrane, thin, permeable, and trembling beneath human error. The living did not step cleanly away from the dead. They hovered beside them, bound by soil, memory, and unfinished ritual. Between breath and burial stretched a fragile interval where the soul might hesitate, where something meant to depart could linger. It was here, in this narrow and uncertain space, that the Strigoi took form. Villages were built close to their graves. The dead lay within sight of the living, pressed into the same earth that fed their crops and swallowed their waste. There was no distant cemetery, no sealed separation. Bones rested beneath footsteps, beneath prayer, beneath the slow routines of survival. Death was intimate, unavoidable, and profoundly unstable. To bury someone was not merely to dispose of a body, it was to guide a soul safely away. And the fear was never that the dead might leave too soon, but that they might not leave at all. Medieval Europe did not understand death as a single moment. It was a process, one that could be interrupted, corrupted, or undone. The final breath was only the beginning. What followed mattered just as much. The washing of the body, the positioning of the limbs, the timing of burial, the words spoken over cooling flesh. Each gesture was a thread in a fragile tapestry. One misstep, one omission, and the soul might lose its way. In this world, morality did not end with life. It followed the body into the grave. Those who died suddenly, violently, or outside the sanctified rhythms of the church were thought especially vulnerable. Suicides, unbaptized children, criminals, outsiders. Those who lived at the margins were believed to hover there in death as well. Their graves were watched with unease, their soil suspected of movement. The Strigoi was not born from wickedness alone, but from suspicion. A life lived wrong did not simply offend God. It destabilized the order between worlds. Medieval belief held that the soul required harmony to pass on. Harmony with faith, with community, with ritual law. When that harmony fractured, the soul could fracture with it, lingering in a restless state, neither alive nor properly dead. Prayer was meant to seal the passage. Words spoken by the living were believed to shape the unseen journey of the dead. An improper prayer, misremembered, rushed, or absent, was not a small failure. It was a rupture. Silence over a grave could echo beyond it. In that silence, fear imagined movement. Burial itself was an act of containment. The body had to be placed correctly, oriented toward holy directions, weighted by earth and custom. Shrouds mattered. Coffins mattered. Even the depth of the grave carried meaning. A shallow burial invited disturbance. From animals, from rot, from the restless forces believed to prowl the threshold between worlds. If the earth did not hold the body firmly, perhaps it could not hold the soul either. The medieval mind did not separate the spiritual from the physical. What happened to the body was what happened to the soul. Decay was not neutral, it was a sign. Preservation was not peaceful, it was suspicious. When bodies failed to behave as expected, belief rushed in to explain what observation could not. And so uncertainty became terror. The Strigoi existed not as a singular creature, but as a condition, a state of being trapped between endings. It was the memory of a soul that had not crossed properly, tethered by error, guilt, or neglect. In folklore it rose not because it wanted to, but because something had gone wrong. It was not summoned by malice, but by imbalance. This fear was intensified by the Church's uneasy authority over death. Christianity offered salvation, but it also imposed conditions. The soul's fate depended on adherence, confession, sacrament. To die outside the Church's embrace was to risk abandonment. Yet even within faith, older anxieties persisted. Pagan burial customs lingered beneath Christian rites, blending fear with doctrine. The Church spoke of heaven and hell, but the villages whispered of graves that breathed. In these whispers, the dead were never entirely gone. They watched, they waited, they remembered slights and unfinished bonds. The Strigoi was believed to return not always in monstrous form, but as illness, as wasting, as misfortune that crept through households without explanation. Death did not need a body to walk, it only needed proximity. Psychologically, this fear reflected a world with little control over mortality. Disease arrived without warning. Crops failed. Children died in their sleep. Explanations were scarce, and randomness was unbearable. The idea that death might not be final, that it could leak back into life, gave suffering a cause. If the dead were restless, then perhaps the living could act. Graves could be opened. Rituals could be corrected. Order could be restored. But this also meant that death became moral surveillance. Every life was measured not only for how it was lived, but for how it would behave afterward. The fear of becoming Strigoi disciplined the living as much as it haunted the dead. It warned against deviation, against solitude, against silence. To belong was to be safe, both in life and beyond it. The thin wall between worlds was not a natural boundary. It was maintained through constant effort, prayer, ritual, memory, and fear. When that effort failed, belief imagined collapse. The Strigoi was not an invader from another realm. It was what slipped through when the wall cracked. In this way, the Strigoi reveals something deeply human. It is the embodiment of anxiety over unfinished endings. Of the terror that death, once begun, might not complete itself. That identity might persist where it no longer belongs. That the past might refuse to stay buried. Even today, the image lingers, not as superstition but as metaphor. We still fear unresolved deaths. We still seek closure, ritual explanation. We still believe that certain endings must be handled carefully, or they will return to trouble us. The medieval fear was not primitive. It was precise. It understood that the boundary between what is gone and what remains is fragile. And in the quiet earth of forgotten villages, beneath wooden crosses and unmarked stones, that thin wall once trembled. The Strigoi did not need to rise. It only needed to be imagined. And in that imagination, the living confronted their deepest fear. Not that the dead were monstrous, but that death itself was uncertain. In the deep silence of the old cemeteries, long before the language of science learned to name decay, The dead were watched as closely as the living. Earth was not trusted to keep its secrets. Each grave was a threshold, and beneath the soil, bodies were expected to obey an ancient agreement: to cool, to pale, to collapse gently back into nature. When they did not, fear found its proof. Grave diggers were the first witnesses. Their hands knew the weight of soil, the resistance of roots, the slow surrender of wood to rot. They had seen death often enough to believe they understood its habits. And yet, there were moments when a coffin was opened. By accident, by suspicion, by command, and the body inside defied expectation. The flesh appeared swollen, the skin flushed as though touched by warmth. Limbs seemed full, not withered. In rare and terrifying cases, blood darkened the lips or stained the shroud. To the medieval eye, this was not stillness. It was disturbance. The grave was meant to be a place of certainty. Once sealed, it reassured the living that death was complete, that the boundary held. But these bodies, ruddy, bloated, uncollapsed, suggested motion beneath the surface of the world. They looked less like remains and more like sleepers interrupted. In villages already fragile with hunger, disease, and sudden loss, such signs carried unbearable meaning. Today we know what they were seeing. The gases of decomposition bloating the abdomen. The rupture of internal organs releasing dark fluids through mouth and nose. The illusion of warmth, trapped beneath layers of soil and wood. But knowledge arrives only after fear has already shaped the story. In those centuries, science had no words for these processes. The body spoke in symbols instead, and those symbols were read as warning. Death, in the medieval imagination, was not purely biological. It was moral, spiritual, and social. A corpse that failed to decay correctly was not simply an anomaly. It was an accusation. Something had gone wrong, and the community would suffer for it. Livestock fell ill. Children wasted away. Crops blackened in the fields. Misfortune demanded a cause, and the grave began to answer. The swollen dead became evidence not of nature, but of appetite. Blood at the mouth was interpreted as feeding. The fullness of the corpse suggested it had been nourished. These bodies were not imagined as mindless. They were thought to rise, to walk unseen, to drink life from the living. The Strigoi was not yet a vampire of fiction. It was a corpse behaving badly. In this world, burial was not a passive act. It was a ritual negotiation with unseen forces. The position of the body, the prayers spoken, the objects placed in the coffin, all were safeguards against unrest. When decomposition defied expectation, it was understood as proof that these protections had failed. The earth itself had rejected the dead. Grave diggers became reluctant priests of terror. Their reports spread quietly, carried from mouth to mouth in hushed tones. A body that should have collapsed had not. A face that should have darkened looked flushed. The dead, it was said, were changing underground. They were ripening. Such fears did not emerge in isolation. Europe was haunted by epidemics that hollowed villages overnight. Plague left little time for understanding, only for reaction. Bodies were buried quickly, often improperly. In this chaos, decomposition appeared unnatural because death itself had become unnatural. Too sudden, too frequent, too close. The human mind, faced with patterns it cannot explain, reaches for intention. These corpses seemed active, purposeful. They felt warm because they were imagined as alive. They bled because they were believed to feed. The living did not yet know how the body breaks down, but they knew how predators behave. And so they made the dead into one. The fear was not theatrical. It was intimate. Families believed they were being visited by their own relatives, drained not by strangers, but by familiar hands. The Strigoi was often a parent, a spouse, a child. Decomposition did not merely threaten the living, it betrayed them. This betrayal cut deeply into the medieval relationship with death. To die was expected. To decay properly was a duty. The corpse that refused to collapse violated the natural order and the moral one. It suggested unfinished business, unresolved sin, or spiritual contamination. These bodies became symbols of lives improperly lived. Psychologically, the terror was precise. It centered on the fear that death might not end suffering, that it might transform it. A corpse that remained full and colored implied continuation. And continuation meant agency. Agency meant intent. Without microscopes or pathology, medieval communities became their own investigators. They opened graves to look for signs. They listened for rumors. They watched the soil. When decomposition did not match expectation, they acted. These actions were brutal, but they were not irrational within their world. Stakes were driven into bodies not as cruelty, but as containment. Decapitation was performed to sever intention from movement. Burning was meant to purify what the earth could not digest. Each ritual was an attempt to force decay back into obedience. In truth, the real horror was uncertainty. Decomposition was unpredictable. Climate, soil, disease, all altered its course. Cold winter could preserve flesh. A sealed coffin could trap gases. But unpredictability was intolerable in a culture that relied on ritual stability to survive. The Strigoi myth crystallized around these moments of confusion. It offered clarity where none existed. It gave fear a name and an enemy. The corpse that would not decay was no longer an accident. It was a threat that could be confronted. And yet, beneath the myth lies a quieter truth. These fears reveal not cruelty, but vulnerability. Communities were desperate to protect themselves from forces they could not see or measure. They were trying to understand death without the tools to explain it. The bloated corpse was not terrifying because it looked monstrous. It was terrifying because it looked alive. It blurred the boundary everyone depended on. It whispered that death might be unstable, reversible, or incomplete. Over time, science would arrive and reclaim the grave. Decomposition would be mapped, measured, named. The warmth, the swelling, the bleeding would lose their supernatural voice. But the emotional memory remained. Even now, the image lingers. The idea of a body that resists decay still unsettles us. It challenges our expectation that death should be final, orderly, and silent. The medieval fear echoes because it was never truly about monsters. It was about control. The Strigoi was born in the gap between observation and understanding. Where knowledge was absent, meaning rushed in to fill the void. And in that space, the dead were no longer passive. They became participants in the suffering of the living. In those centuries, terror spoke first because it had to. Gave shape to chaos. It made sense of the unspeakable. And long after science found its words, the old fear remained buried in story, waiting, like the corpses themselves, to be uncovered again. In the quiet villages of medieval Eastern Europe, death was never impartial. It remembered who you were. Long before a body was lowered into the soil, judgment had already begun. It whispered through glances at the edge of the village, through half-spoken suspicions carried by smoke and prayer. Some lives were lived under an invisible mark, a stain that could not be confessed away, a difference that lingered even after the heart stopped beating. And when fear came searching for a culprit, it always knew where to look. These were not monsters in life. They were neighbors, widows who spoke too little, strangers who arrived without ancestry. Children who died before baptism could seal them into the Christian world. Men who took their own lives in moments of despair, tearing themselves free from both society and salvation. Their crime was not evil, it was deviation. In a world where survival depended on harmony, difference was dangerous. Medieval communities were bound together by shared rituals of birth, labor, prayer, and burial. Death itself was a public act, governed by precise customs meant to protect both the soul of the deceased and the fragile balance of the living. To die correctly was as important as to live well. A proper death ensured rest. An improper one invited unrest. And so the dead were categorized. Those who died suddenly. Those who died violently. Those who died without confession. Those whose lives had already unsettled the moral order of the village. Their bodies were buried differently, sometimes outside consecrated ground, sometimes with stones pressed against their limbs, sometimes face down, as if the earth itself must be warned. These precautions were not cruelty. They were anxiety given form. When disaster followed, when livestock sickened, when children wasted away with fever, when storms flattened fields already stretched thin, the village searched for meaning. Calamity was never random. It was a message. And messages demanded interpreters. The graveyards were silent, but suspicion was loud. The Strigoi did not emerge from imagination alone. It emerged from investigation. From the reopening of graves under torchlight and prayer. From trembling hands brushing soil away from faces that should have been still. When the earth revealed bodies strangely preserved, bloated, flushed, blood seeping from nose or mouth, belief hardened into certainty. This one is not at rest. Today we understand the language of decay. We know that gases swell the abdomen, that pressure forces fluids outward, that skin darkens and tightens in ways that mimic vitality. But medieval villagers had no such vocabulary. They saw warmth where cold should reign, color where pallor belonged, and they saw guilt made visible. The dead who looked alive were the ones already suspected in memory. Graves were not opened at random. They were opened selectively. The outsider was examined first. The woman who lived alone. The man whose birth was uncertain. The soul whose life had already unsettled the moral geometry of the village. Death did not absolve them. It confirmed what fear had long suggested. In this way, the Strigoi became less a creature than a verdict. To be named Strigoi was to be condemned twice. First by society in life, then by ritual in death. The exhumation itself was a public act, witnessed by neighbors who watched as proof was sought in flesh. When signs aligned with expectation, punishment followed swiftly. Staking, decapitation, burning. Acts performed not with hatred, but with solemn necessity. The community was not seeking revenge. It was seeking relief. Anthropologically, this pattern is familiar. In times of crisis, societies externalize anxiety onto bodies that already exist at the margins. The Strigoi myth provided a framework through which fear could be controlled, localized, and destroyed. Misfortune ceased to be abstract. Had a name, location, grave. By punishing the dead, the living reclaimed order. Yet beneath the ritual lay a quieter truth. These were stories about belonging. About who was allowed rest and who was denied it. The Strigoi revealed a terror not of monsters, but of social fracture. A fear that someone might live or die, outside the rules and bring the entire structure down with them. Even the Church, guardian of salvation, struggled to contain these beliefs. Official doctrine insisted that the dead awaited judgment, not resurrection. But priests often sanctioned exhumations and blessings, blending theology with older folk practices. Faith itself bent beneath the weight of communal dread. Because belief is never purely rational. It is emotional memory made sacred. The criminalization of the dead allowed communities to rewrite tragedy as morality. Hunger became punishment. Disease became consequence. Loss became explainable. The Strigoi was not merely blamed. It was necessary. And yet, there is something profoundly human in this fear. To imagine that the morally suspect could not rest was to insist that the universe was still watching. That nothing escaped judgment. That chaos had boundaries, even if enforced through violence against the powerless. But the dead could not speak in their defense. They lay silent as stories were carved into their bones. As meaning was extracted from the shape of their decay. As memory hardened into myth. Over time these narratives sharpened. The Strigoi became more active, more deliberate, more monstrous. But at its core, it remained what it had always been, a mirror held up to social fear. Not a predator stalking villages, but a warning etched into burial soil. Even now the echo lingers. In how societies mark outsiders. In how deviation is still associated with danger. In how fear searches for bodies to blame. The Strigoi reminds us that monsters are rarely born in forests or shadows. They are born in communities under strain. In moments when grief demands explanation and difference becomes intolerable. In the end, The Strigoi did not rise from the grave because it hungered. It rose because the living needed it to. In the low light of the burial ground, where soil still breathed and grief had not yet cooled, the dead were examined not with instruments but with fear. Lanterns trembled in human hands. Breath fogged the air. And there, upon the face of the corpse, was the sign that silenced reason before it could form. Blood at the mouth. It was never bright, never fresh. A dark, wine-colored stain that clung to lips now stiff, teeth now useless, eyes sealed forever. Yet to the villagers who stood above the grave, it was unmistakable. Blood belonged to the living. Blood belonged to violence. And blood, appearing after death, could only mean one thing: the dead had been active. In medieval Eastern Europe, death was not sterile or distant. It was intimate, familiar, and constantly present. People washed their dead with bare hands. They dressed them, kissed them, lowered them into the earth themselves. They knew what a body should look like when life had left it. And when the corpse violated those expectations, when it bled, swelled, or seemed warm, terror bloomed immediately. No one understood decomposition. There were no words yet for post-mortem purging, no framework for the gases that built beneath the skin, forcing fluids upward through the throat. The body, long after burial, was still a mystery. And mysteries demand meaning. So when blood appeared at the lips, meaning arrived swiftly. To the village mind, the image was simple and devastating. Blood at the mouth looked like feeding, like consumption, like hunger. It suggested that the corpse had risen, pressed its mouth against the living, and returned to the grave satisfied. The logic was visual, not intellectual. It did not require evidence, only resemblance. And belief followed the image as shadow follows form. These exhumations rarely happened in calm times. Graves were opened because something had already gone wrong. A child had died suddenly. A cow collapsed in the field. A sickness crept through the household without name or mercy. When death multiplied, the living searched backward for cause. And the dead, silent and close beneath their feet, became suspects. When the grave was opened, the body was expected to confirm guilt. Blood was the most convincing witness of all. The villagers did not see natural processes. They saw proof of appetite. The mouth, stained and glistening in torchlight, became the center of dread. In folklore, the mouth is a threshold, the place where breath enters and leaves, where words form, where nourishment passes. A mouth marked by blood implied passage, exchange, a boundary crossed. To them, the corpse had not remained closed. This belief did not emerge from superstition alone. It was reinforced by the physical reality of death itself. In some cases, pressure within the abdomen forced dark fluids upward, escaping through nose or mouth. In others, internal bleeding followed disease or trauma. The dead body, obeying chemistry rather than morality, performed acts that looked intentional. But intention was precisely what frightened them. Because intention implied will. And will implied return. The Strigoi was not imagined as a beast lurking in forests. It was envisioned as a neighbor who had failed to stay dead. Blood at the mouth was not monstrous. It was familiar. It suggested the Strigoi fed not on strangers, but on kin, and children, and spouses, on the fragile circle of village life. Fear deepened because it felt personal. The image of the bloodied mouth spread faster than reason ever could. Once seen, it did not need to be explained. It lodged itself into memory, retold at hearths and whispered during prayer. The story sharpened with each telling. The corpse had been red-lipped. The corpse had been fresh. The corpse had smiled. And slowly, feeding became doctrine. In this way, visual horror preceded myth. The vampire was not born from literature, but from anatomy misunderstood. The idea of blood drinking did not arrive fully formed. It crystallized around moments like this, where the body appeared to accuse itself. What terrified these communities most was not the blood itself, but what it suggested about death's stability. If a corpse could bleed, then death was not sealed. If a mouth could stain, then silence was not guaranteed. The grave, once thought final, became porous. And once death was no longer fixed, nothing felt secure. The response was swift and ritualized. The mouth, now seen as the instrument of harm, had to be neutralized. In some regions, stones were forced between the jaws. In others, coins were placed upon the tongue. Sometimes the head was removed entirely, severing the seat of appetite from the body. These acts were not fueled by cruelty, but by fear carefully structured into tradition. They were attempts to close what should never have opened. The blood at the mouth became a signal, a threshold marker between acceptable death and dangerous death. A corpse without it was mourned. A corpse with it was investigated. An investigation, in those centuries, often ended in violence. Yet beneath the fear lay something deeply human. These villagers were surrounded by illness they could not cure, hunger they could not escape, and winters that erased entire bloodlines. Watching loved ones die inexplicably carved wounds into the psyche. Blood at the mouth offered an answer, however terrible, gave shape to chaos. It transformed random suffering into consequence. Someone had fed. And if someone had fed, someone could be stopped. In this way, belief followed the image not because people were foolish, but because they were desperate. The human mind seeks causality even when none exists. Especially then. The Strigoi, as imagined through the blood-stained mouth, became a mirror of communal anxiety. It embodied the fear that death was contagious. That one life, improperly ended, could poison many others. That the boundary between bodies was fragile. And so the mouth, once a symbol of breath and speech, became the emblem of terror. Centuries later, science would explain what the villagers saw. Medical texts would describe purging fluids, internal pressure, post-mortem changes. The mouth would be reclassified as an exit point, not an entry. Blood would lose its supernatural voice. But knowledge does not erase memory. The image endured. It passed from grave to story, from story to legend. And when later centuries imagined vampires with crimson lips and hungry mouths, they were unknowingly echoing these moments. These cold nights where villagers leaned over open graves and saw something they could not understand. Something that looked like feeding. Even now, the power of that image remains. Blood at the mouth still unsettles us. It still implies violence, hunger, unfinished business. It still whispers that something has crossed a boundary it should not have crossed. Because beneath all the explanations, the fear was never truly about blood. It was about the terror that the dead were not done with us yet. In the villages of old Eastern Europe, fear did not arrive with screams. It came quietly, like fog drifting between wooden homes at dusk, settling into the spaces where certainty once lived. There were no claws at the window, no shadows leaping from graves. Instead, there was a cow found stiff in the morning frost. Child who failed to wake. A field that yielded nothing but brittle stalks and silence. Misfortune rarely announced itself, but it always demanded meaning. For communities bound tightly to the land and to one another, survival depended on explanation. Hunger could be endured. Death could be buried. But chaos, unexplained, wandering chaos, was intolerable. And so fear learned to move not as a creature, but as a thought. Suggestion. A rumor passed carefully from mouth to mouth, gaining weight with each retelling. They said something was wrong beneath the earth. The Strigoi did not spread through blood or bite. It spread through observation, through coincidence, through the fragile human instinct to connect unrelated suffering into a single, intelligible cause. When livestock sickened across multiple households, it could not be chance. When several children fell ill within weeks, it could not be the weather alone. When crops failed in a season already thin with hope, the explanation had to be larger than soil or sky. Had to be personal. In these communities, the dead were not distant. Graves lay close to homes, to churches, to paths walked daily. Ancestors were not abstract memories but physical presences, resting just beneath familiar ground. Death had not yet been sealed away behind hospital walls or municipal cemeteries. It lingered, it watched, and sometimes people believed it interfered. When suffering clustered too tightly to ignore, the mind searched backward. Who had died recently? Who had been buried improperly? Who had lived a life that felt unfinished? Fear does not invent without material. Selects. Rumor was the vessel. A whisper at the well. A muttered thought after evening prayer. Someone recalled a corpse that had not looked right. Another remembered strange sounds near the graveyard. Each voice alone carried little weight, but together they formed consensus. And consensus, once formed, becomes reality. The Strigoi emerged not as a monster, but as a diagnosis. In an age without germ theory, without statistical understanding of disease or famine, human pattern recognition became both a gift and a curse. The mind, trained to find order in nature, imposed intention on randomness. Illness was not random, it was caused. Death was not arbitrary, it was sent. And if suffering had an origin, then perhaps it could be stopped. The dead became convenient carriers of this belief. They could not protest, they could not defend themselves, and they already existed at the boundary of fear. Once suspicion settled on a grave, it spread outward like infection. Families avoided one another. Old grievances resurfaced under the weight of supernatural justification. The Strigoi was blamed not only for death, but for discord, transforming private anxiety into communal certainty. Fear became social. Anthropologically, this pattern is not unique. Across cultures and centuries, societies under stress often locate danger in the margins. Among outsiders, the dead, the deviant, the liminal. What made the Strigoi unique was its intimacy. It was not an external invader. It was kin, neighbor, ancestor. Fear was no longer outside the village. It lived within its memory. This is how terror becomes contagious. Once the idea took hold, evidence appeared everywhere. Normal sounds became omens. Natural decay became movement. The swelling of a corpse, caused by gases of decomposition, was interpreted as proof of feeding. Blood escaping the mouth after death became confirmation of hunger. Each misunderstood biological process reinforced belief, tightening fear's grip. And belief, once reinforced, resists correction. The community responded the only way it knew how. Collectively. Rituals were not acts of individual hysteria, but coordinated attempts at healing. Exhumations were performed with witnesses. Decisions were made by elders, priests, and neighbors together. Violence toward the dead was framed not as cruelty, but as necessity. They believed they were treating a disease. In this sense, the Strigoi was never a solitary monster. It was a shared hallucination shaped by grief, scarcity, and uncertainty. Fear moved from mind to mind with greater efficiency than any physical contagion. And like all epidemics, it thrived where understanding was weakest and desperation strongest. Psychologically, this fear served a function. By assigning suffering to a source, communities regained a sense of agency. If the dead caused illness, then the dead could be stopped. The chaos of existence was narrowed into a single target. And for a moment the world felt manageable again. But this relief came at a cost. Once fear had a shape, it demanded action. Graves were opened. Bodies were altered. The sanctity of burial was violated in the name of protection. Each ritual reinforced the narrative, embedding it deeper into collective memory. The Strigoi became real not because it existed, but because it was acted upon. Memory remembers actions more vividly than doubts. Over generations, these stories hardened. The original context, disease cycles, environmental hardship, nutritional deficiency, faded from memory. What remained was the image of the restless dead. Fear, passed down, lost its original cause but retained its emotional weight. This is how myth survives truth. The Strigoi endured not because people were ignorant, but because they were human. Because they loved their children, feared starvation, and needed reasons when none were visible. The monster was not born from cruelty, but from care twisted by uncertainty. Even today, echoes of this pattern remain. We still seek villains for systemic suffering. We still personalize misfortune. We still allow fear to travel socially, amplified by repetition and belief. The Strigoi is ancient, but its mechanism is timeless. It reminds us that the most dangerous contagions do not require teeth or claws. They require only a story. And once that story enters a community already weakened by loss, it spreads silently, invisibly, until fear itself becomes the disease. In the hush that followed a burial, when the last prayer faded into cold air and earth sealed the body from sight, peace was never guaranteed. For many pre-modern communities, death did not end fear, it sharpened it. Beneath the soil, unseen processes unfolded, and without knowledge to explain them, imagination filled the darkness. When misfortune followed a funeral, when sickness spread or animals collapsed in their fields, the grave itself became suspect. And so began the rituals of unmaking. These acts, staking, decapitation, burning, are often remembered through the crude lens of horror. They appear violent, irrational, even cruel. Yet to those who performed them, they were neither sadism nor superstition. They were medicine. A last, terrible form of care administered not to the dead, but to the living who remained behind. In the villages of Eastern Europe, where belief moved as slowly as the seasons and tradition weighed heavier than written law, the dead were not inert. They were powerful. A corpse was a vessel, still connected to the world it had left, capable of influencing weather, health, fertility, and fortune. When that balance was disturbed, when the dead did not decay as expected, or when the community's suffering demanded explanation, intervention became necessary. The grave was reopened. What villagers found beneath the earth often confirmed their worst fears. Bodies appeared swollen, their skin darkened, their faces twisted into expressions that felt almost intentional. Blood pooled at the mouth or seeped from the nose. To modern science, these were natural signs of decomposition. Gases expanding, tissues rupturing, fluids escaping. But to medieval eyes, untrained and already afraid, these were signs of movement. Signs of feeding. Signs that something had gone wrong. And when death went wrong, it had to be corrected. The stake was not chosen at random. Wood was believed to pin the soul to the body, to anchor it where it belonged. Driven through the chest or abdomen, it was meant to immobilize whatever force animated the corpse. This was not execution, it was restraint. The dead were being bound, not punished. Each blow was delivered with prayer. Each motion guided by ritual precision. Fear demanded accuracy. Decapitation followed a similar logic. The head was the seat of identity, of sight and speech, of memory and will. To remove it was to sever intention from action. The skull was often buried separately, placed between the legs or turned face down, ensuring that the dead could not find their way back. Orientation mattered. Direction mattered. Every detail was believed to restore order to a world that had slipped into peril. Fire, the most final of all, was used sparingly, but decisively. Burning erased corruption completely. Sh could not rise. Smoke carried danger away from the village and into the sky. Fire was purification, not vengeance. It returned the body to elements that could no longer threaten the fragile boundary between worlds. These rituals were rarely carried out in haste. They unfolded slowly, communally, often under the supervision of elders, priests, or healers. There was no frenzy here, only grim resolve. Violence was not celebrated. It was endured. Each act was heavy with grief, for the body being undone was often once a neighbor, a relative, a familiar face now transformed into a source of terror. The Strigoi, whether named or not, was never truly the enemy. Chaos was. Disease had no germ theory. Mental illness had no diagnosis. Sudden death, stillbirths, crop failure, and famine arrived without explanation. In such a world, fear required structure. Ritual provided that structure. It transformed helplessness into action, uncertainty into ceremony. By intervening in the grave, communities reclaimed a sense of agency over forces that otherwise felt divine, arbitrary, and cruel. Religion did not eliminate these practices. It absorbed them. Christian theology, spreading across Eastern Europe, struggled to reconcile resurrection doctrine with burial terror. Official teachings insisted that the dead would rise only at the end of time, yet parish priests sanctioned corpse exorcisms and post-mortem punishments. Holy water was poured into open graves. Psalms were recited as blades fell. The sacred and the profane merged, not in contradiction, but in cooperation. Faith alone was not enough. The body demanded attention. Anthropologically, these rituals reveal something deeply human: the refusal to accept that death is passive. The living have always suspected that endings are unstable, that mistakes linger, that improper rites echo. The fear was not that the dead were evil, but that they were unfinished, that something essential had been missed, and now demanded correction. The Strigoi myth, at its core, is not about monsters feeding on blood. It is about responsibility, about the terror of doing death wrong. Every culture carries its own version of this fear. From Egyptian mummification to Tibetan sky burials, humanity has always labored intensely over the dead, believing that the way a body is treated shapes the fate of both soul and society. In Eastern Europe, that labor sometimes took the form of unmaking what had already been made. To modern eyes, these acts appear brutal. But brutality implies indifference. These rituals were anything but. They were performed with shaking hands, with whispered prayers, with the knowledge that what was being destroyed had once been loved. Violence here was a form of grief struggling to protect itself. And yet, once performed, relief often followed. Communities reported that illness faded, livestock recovered, dreams quieted. Whether by coincidence or psychological release, the ritual worked. Order was restored, not because the dead had truly risen, but because fear had been given shape, and shape could be confronted. In time, medicine would enter the tomb. Decomposition would be explained. Fear would lose its authority, but memory would remain. The image of the restless dead lingered, passed through story and folklore, sharpened by retelling. What began as burial panic slowly transformed into vampire legend. Teeth grew longer. Intent became malicious. Ritual became myth. Yet beneath every stake-driven and flame-lit lies a quieter truth. These rituals were never about cruelty. They were about survival in a world without answers. About communities standing at the edge of the unknown, armed only with belief, trying desperately to keep the darkness from spreading further. The grave, in those moments, was not just a place of death. It was a battlefield, between chaos and control, ignorance and meaning, fear and the fragile hope that order could still be restored. And though the rituals have faded, the impulse behind them has not. Even now, when understanding fails us, we still reach for ceremony. We still create symbols to face what cannot be reasoned away. Because deep down we have always known this simple truth. When the world breaks without explanation, humans do not stop believing. They perform rituals, and hope the darkness listens. In the centuries when the earth still felt close to heaven and hell, the church inherited a fear it did not create. Beneath cathedral stones and village chapels lay older anxieties, older than Scripture, older than Rome itself. Long before Christian bells rang over Eastern Europe, the dead were already suspected of restlessness. Burial was not merely an act of farewell. It was a fragile ritual of containment. And when Christianity spread across these lands, it did not erase that fear. It absorbed it. The Church taught that death was a passage, a threshold guided by divine order. The soul, once freed from flesh, would rise toward judgment, salvation, or punishment. The grave was meant to be quiet, a temporary resting place until resurrection at the end of time. But the villages did not always see quiet graves. They saw sickness after funerals. They heard animals panic near burial grounds. They dreamed of the dead walking back into their homes, unfinished and unblessed. Theology spoke of heaven and hell. Folklore whispered of something trapped in between. Christian doctrine, precise and textual, struggled against the ambiguity of decomposition. Bodies did not behave as Scripture suggested they should. They swelled. They bled. They groaned as gases escaped their lungs. To a medieval mind trained in symbol rather than biology, this was not decay. It was resistance. The corpse appeared to fight its own death. And so the question arose, quietly at first, then with urgency. What if the soul had not departed? Priests found themselves standing at gravesides not only as shepherds of souls, but as negotiators with fear. The people demanded answers, and faith could not simply dismiss what entire communities believed they had witnessed. When villagers spoke of Strigoi, of the dead who fed on life, who returned with ruddy faces and bloodied mouths, the church did not always deny it. Instead, it adapted. In remote parishes, far from the doctrinal centers of Christendom, priests sanctioned acts that hovered dangerously close to heresy. Corpses were exhumed and examined under holy authority. Prayers were spoken not for the living, but against the dead. Stakes were driven not as pagan violence, but as spiritual correction. The body became a battleground where theology and folklore merged into a single, trembling practice. These were not acts of superstition alone. They were acts of pastoral care. The Church understood that belief, once rooted in fear, could not be uprooted by denial. To reject the Strigoi outright would have been to abandon the people to terror. And so faith bent, quietly, reluctantly, toward the earth. In ecclesiastical records, one finds unsettling language, clerics describing unclean corpses, corrupted remains, bodies suspected of harboring malign forces. The vocabulary is cautious, but the implication is clear. Something had gone wrong after death. Not demonic possession in the living sense, but a failure of the soul's journey. The Strigoi was no longer merely folklore. It became a theological anomaly. Christianity had long inherited older burial traditions, repurposing them under new symbols. Pagan graves were rededicated. Ancestral rituals were baptized into Christian form. But the fear of the restless dead proved stubborn. It did not fade with the sign of the cross. Instead, it found shelter beneath it. The Church taught that improper burial could endanger the soul. Those who died without confession, without baptism, or by suicide existed in a dangerous spiritual limbo. They were buried at crossroads, outside consecrated ground, or with heavy stones pressed upon their chests. These practices were not condemned, they were tolerated. Sometimes they were encouraged. The Strigoi thrived in these margins, where doctrine hesitated. What made the Strigoi particularly threatening to Christian order was not its hunger, but its implication. If the dead could rise, then death was not absolute. If the grave could fail, then salvation was uncertain. The Strigoi represented a fracture in divine certainty, a suggestion that ritual, prayer, and moral living might not be enough. This is why exorcisms were performed on corpses. Holy water poured into open graves. Psalms spoken over rotting flesh. The Church did not declare these acts false. It framed them as corrections, spiritual repairs to a broken passage. The dead were not monsters, they were mistakes. In this blending of theology and folklore, the Strigoi changed shape. It was no longer merely a village ghost or a pagan revenant. It became a Christian fear, wrapped in the language of sin and redemption. The restless dead were those who had lived wrongly, died wrongly, or been buried wrongly. Moral failure followed them beyond life. Yet even as the Church sought to contain the Strigoi, it also preserved it. By acknowledging the possibility of restless corpses, faith granted the myth legitimacy. The grave remained a place of tension, not peace. And the people learned that even holy ground could not always protect them. Anthropologically, this moment reveals something profound. The Church did not simply impose belief from above. It listened, negotiated. It absorbed the emotional realities of its followers. The Strigoi survived because it addressed a fear that doctrine alone could not silence, the fear that death is not stable, that the boundary between worlds is porous, and that the earth does not always keep what it takes. Psychologically, the Strigoi was a mirror. It reflected guilt, unresolved grief, and communal anxiety. When someone died suddenly, violently, or socially condemned, the fear did not end with burial. It fermented. The church provided language for sin, but folklore provided imagery for fear. Together, they shaped a terror that felt both sacred and forbidden. Over time, as medicine advanced and anatomy demystified decay, the church slowly withdrew from these practices. The corpse became biological, not spiritual. But the memory lingered. Stories outlived rituals. The Strigoi retreated from theology into legend, where it would later be reborn as the vampire. Sharper, hungrier, more theatrical. Yet beneath that transformation remains this quieter truth. The Strigoi endured because even faith feared what lay beneath the earth. Christianity promised eternal life, but the grave offered uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, belief faltered just enough for myth to breathe. The church rang bells, built stone walls, and spoke of heaven. But below, in the soil, something older waited, an unease that no prayer could fully bury. And so the dead were never entirely silent. They lingered in fear, in ritual, and in memory, reminding the living that faith too has its shadows. In the quiet villages of Eastern Europe, death was not a single moment. It was a process, slow, fragile, and filled with peril. To die was not enough. One had to be done correctly. The body prepared, the soul guided, the earth sealed with care. When any part of this ritual failed, fear took shape. And in that failure the Strigoi emerged. The Strigoi was never imagined as a creature that chose darkness. It was not born from malice or hunger or will. It was born from error. A misstep in burial. A prayer forgotten. A life lived too close to the margins of acceptance. In a world where death had rules, the Strigoi was the consequence of breaking them. For pre-modern societies, the dead were dangerously close. Graves lay at the edges of villages or beneath church floors. Bones were familiar. Corpses were handled, washed, dressed, and watched. Death did not disappear behind hospital walls. It lingered in homes, in fields, in memory. And because it lingered, it demanded precision. There was a belief that the dead required careful choreography to leave this world properly. The body had to be oriented, the mouth closed, the limbs positioned, iron placed, prayers spoken, earth packed tight. Each gesture was believed to calm the soul, to tell it that its time among the living had truly ended. When this ritual sequence fractured, anxiety followed. The Strigoi was the embodiment of that anxiety. A person buried too soon, before breath had fully left the body. A corpse interred during a liminal hour, between sunset and night. A death that occurred violently, shamefully, or without sacrament. These were not merely unfortunate endings. They were dangerous ones. The community feared that such souls had not been released, but trapped, caught between decay and memory. In these cultures, death was not morally neutral. Carried social weight. How one died mattered as much as how one lived. Suicides, criminals, outsiders, the unbaptized, all occupied uncertain spiritual territory. Their burials were rushed, altered, or performed in silence. And when misfortune followed, it was their graves that were opened. The Strigoi was not accused, it was diagnosed. When villagers unearthed bodies and found them swollen, flushed, or bleeding, they believed they were witnessing proof of unrest. They did not know the language of decomposition. They did not understand gases, purging fluids, or the illusions of post-mortem change. What they saw was movement where there should have been stillness, warmth where there should have been cold. To them this was not nature. It was a mistake still unfolding. The terror of the Strigoi reveals a culture deeply afraid of doing death wrong. In a world without medical certainty, burial was the final responsibility of the living. If calamity followed, if animals sickened, children wasted, or shadows grew heavier, it meant someone had failed. And failure demanded correction. This is why the rituals against the Strigoi were not acts of hatred, but acts of repair. Staking, decapitation, burning, these were not punishments inflicted upon monsters. They were attempts to finish what had been left incomplete. To reassert order where uncertainty had taken root. The dead were not being destroyed. They were being finalized. In this sense, the Strigoi was less a predator and more a symptom. A cultural fever arising when explanation ran thin. It thrived in moments where knowledge faltered and responsibility felt unbearable. Because if death itself could go wrong, then anyone could be next. The fear was not of being attacked by the dead. It was of becoming one of them. This terror speaks to a deeper psychological truth. Human beings need endings to be clean. We need death to be final, orderly, and meaningful. When it is not, when bodies linger, when grief stretches too long, when the dead appear unchanged, we begin to doubt the boundary itself. The Strigoi lived in that doubt. It was a reminder that rituals were not symbolic, they were necessary. That forgetting a step could unravel the cosmos. That the dead were watching, waiting, and capable of returning if mishandled. Over time, this belief hardened into myth. The Strigoi grew teeth. Hunger was added. Agency replaced accident. But beneath the later embellishments, the original fear remained intact. Death is unstable, and humans are not always equipped to manage it. Anthropologically, this fear is universal. Cultures across the world developed elaborate funerary systems not merely to honor the dead, but to protect the living. Burial rites are technologies of control, ways to tame the unknown. The Strigoi emerges where that control fractures. It tells us that early societies did not see monsters as external threats, but as consequences. The horror was not out there. It was beneath the floorboards, behind the church walls, inside the choices people made when grief clouded judgment. In this way, the Strigoi is profoundly human. It reflects a society struggling to explain death without science, to manage decay without language, and to preserve meaning in a world where bodies betrayed expectations. It was easier to believe that the dead were restless than to accept that death itself was unpredictable. And so, the Strigoi was named, catalogued, ritualized, given boundaries. Because a fear with a name is easier to face than one without. Yet even now, long after anatomy replaced superstition, the echo remains. We still fear improper endings. We still worry about unfinished goodbyes. We still sense that some deaths linger longer than they should. The Strigoi survives not because people believed in monsters, but because they feared mistakes. It stands as a reminder that myths are rarely about what they claim to describe. They are about responsibility, guilt, and the unbearable weight of finality. They are about the living trying to protect themselves from the chaos that follows loss. And in the quiet soil of forgotten cemeteries, beneath crosses worn smooth by centuries of rain, the Strigoi still waits, not as a creature of blood and hunger, but as a memory of how deeply we feared failing the dead. Because sometimes, the most terrifying thing is not that the dead might rise, but that we did not lay them to rest properly when we had the chance. Time does not erase fear. It refines it. In the long centuries after Rome's roads crumbled and the world grew smaller, memory traveled by mouth and firelight. Stories were no longer written to endure. They were spoken to survive. Each telling became a careful sharpening, a quiet act of preservation. Fear, like bone shaped by water, grew smoother and deadlier with age. At first, the Strigoi was not a creature of legend. It was an explanation. A murmur in the village when cattle sickened without cause. A reason whispered when a child failed to wake. In a world ruled by seasons and soil, death rarely arrived cleanly. It lingered. It returned. And when it did, people needed a name for what haunted the edge of their understanding. The grave was never silent in medieval Eastern Europe. Breathe. Bodies swelled beneath the earth, gases stretching skin into the illusion of life. Blood seeped from mouths and noses, dark and wet against linen. Fingernails appeared to grow. Teeth seemed longer. The dead, it seemed, were changing. To the modern eye, these are processes natural, inevitable. But to a village shaped by famine, plague, and prayer, decomposition looked like intention. The corpse was not resting. It was feeding. And so the Strigoi began to change. Early traditions described them vaguely. Restless dead, spirits out of place, souls that failed to cross the threshold between worlds. But as generations passed, oral tradition did what it always does. It clarified terror. The formless became defined. Hunger gained purpose. The dead were no longer merely unsettled. They were predatory. Teeth lengthened not because of biology, but because fear demanded a weapon. In Romanian folklore, the Strigoi evolved into something more precise. A revenant that rose from its grave to drain the living, sometimes of blood, sometimes of breath, sometimes of vitality itself. This was not yet the aristocratic vampire of later centuries. There were no castles, no velvet cloaks. The Strigoi was familiar. It wore the face of a neighbor, cousin, a child who had died too soon. This intimacy was the horror. The medieval village was a closed world. Survival depended on trust. To imagine that death could turn kin into a parasite was to fracture the most sacred human bond. But belief persisted because it explained the unexplainable. When illness struck household after household, it was easier to blame a single malevolent source than to accept the randomness of disease. Fear seeks patterns. Myth provides them. Graves were reopened not out of cruelty, but necessity. Communities inspected their dead with trembling reverence. A body found too fresh was evidence. Blood in the mouth was guilt. A corpse that resisted decay was a threat. And so rituals emerged, staking the heart, severing the head, burning the remains, not as superstition but as medicine. A final attempt to restore order between the living and the dead. Here myth and psychology intertwined. The Strigoi was not born from imagination alone. It was shaped by grief unresolved, by guilt lingering after death, by the terror of watching loved ones waste away while faith offered no answers. In this sense, the vampire myth was not escapism. It was realism, filtered through belief. As Christianity spread deeper into Eastern Europe, older pagan fears did not vanish. They adapted. The Strigoi absorbed new meanings, becoming a symbol of spiritual corruption as much as physical decay. A soul that failed to rest was no longer merely unfortunate, it was sinful. The undead body became proof of moral failure, a visible sign that something had gone wrong beyond the grave. And still the stories sharpened. By the early modern period, travelers and scholars began recording what villagers already knew. Western Europe listened with fascination and dread as tales of Eastern revenants crossed borders. Latin texts transformed oral warnings into written fact. The Strigoi was translated, renamed, refined. Fiction inherited fear, and gave it a face. The long teeth became fangs. Hunger narrowed into bloodlust. The restless dead became immortal predators, bound by rules that made them legible and terrifying. Sunlight, holy symbols, thresholds, these were not random inventions. They reflected deep anxieties about purity, boundaries, and control. The vampire could enter only if invited, because the greatest fear was not invasion. It was consent. This evolution marked a turning point. What began as communal trauma hardened into archetype. The vampire was no longer just a symptom of death's confusion. It became a mirror held to the living, a figure of excess, desire, and transgression. Where the Strigoi once embodied disease and decay, the vampire came to represent appetite without limit. Immortality, stripped of its romance, was revealed as consumption. Yet even as the myth grew elaborate, its core remained unchanged. The vampire fed because it lacked something essential. It was incomplete. Severed from the natural cycle of life and death, it existed in suspension, a being trapped between worlds, driven by need it could never satisfy. This is why the myth endured. The vampire was not frightening because it was powerful. It was frightening because it was familiar. It carried human traits to their breaking point. Hunger without satiety, life without growth, memory without release. It was what happened when the dead refused to let go, and the living refused to understand death. By the time literature claimed the vampire as its own, the transformation was complete. But beneath the polished fiction, the old fear still pulsed. Every elegant predator cast a long shadow backward, toward muddy graves, candlelit vigils, and villagers who listened for footsteps where none should be. The Strigoi never vanished. It was renamed. In this way, myth does not replace reality. It preserves it, compressed into symbol, carried forward in story. What once explained sickness and sorrow became entertainment, then metaphor, then legend. But the emotional truth remained intact, waiting for each new generation to rediscover it in different form. Fear does not need belief to survive. Only memory. And so, from grave soil to printed page, the Strigoi's journey reveals something essential about us. When death frightens us too deeply to face, we give it teeth. When grief lingers too long to bear, we let it rise. And when fiction finally gives fear a name, we mistake the mask for the source. But the monster was never the corpse that would not rest. It was the living who could not accept that all things must. In the cold chambers beneath stone churches and shallow village graves, bodies whispered through swelling flesh and darkened veins. Skin rose as if breathing. Blood crept from the mouth like a final confession. Nails seemed to grow. Faces tightened into expressions that unsettled the living. For centuries, these changes were not understood as silence, but as intention. The corpse was not resting. It was working. Death to the pre-modern world was not an ending. It was a process, slow and ambiguous, unfolding beneath the soil. And in that liminal space between breath and rot, fear took root. The dead did not merely decay. They transformed. Then, quietly, without ceremony, medicine descended into the tomb. By the late Renaissance and early modern period, Europe's relationship with the body began to shift. Curiosity, once dangerous, once heretical, found permission through science. Anatomy theaters rose beside cathedrals. Surgeons, physicians, and scholars peeled back flesh not to banish spirits, but to understand structure. The human body, long treated as sacred vessel or corrupted shell, became a map. With scalpel and ink, medicine learned to read what myth had once translated. Swelling was no longer the sign of a corpse feeding on the living. It was gas, methane, hydrogen sulfide, born from bacteria devouring tissue in darkness. The abdomen ballooned not with stolen breath, but with fermentation. Blood at the lips was not proof of nocturnal violence, but the result of pressure forcing fluids upward as organs collapsed. The groans reported by grave watchers were not voices returning from the underworld, but air escaping through vocal cords stiff with death. Even the illusion of growing hair and nails, so often cited as evidence that the dead still lived, was revealed as a trick of dehydration. Skin retracted. What remained appeared longer, sharper, more alive than before. These revelations did not arrive as thunder. They arrived slowly, hesitantly, written in Latin margins and demonstrated on cadavers stolen from gallows and graveyards. Knowledge advanced by candlelight, while outside, the old fears continued to burn. Pathology named what superstition had mythologized. And yet, naming is not erasing. Because medicine entered the tomb centuries too late. By the time anatomy explained decay, the stories had already settled into the bones of culture. Entire cosmologies had formed around the restless dead. In Eastern Europe, revenants were hunted, staked, and burned. In rural England, corpses were pinned to the earth with iron. In the Balkans, bodies suspected of vampirism were exhumed and mutilated. Not out of cruelty, but out of desperate protection. These were not ignorant acts. They were emotional technologies, rituals designed to restore order in a world where death did not behave. For communities without microscopes or germ theory, the grave was not a closed door. It was a threshold. And when that threshold appeared to open, when the dead swelled, bled, or refused to rot, medicine had not yet provided another language. So myth spoke instead. The rise of anatomy did not banish the supernatural overnight. Competed with it. For generations, two explanations coexisted uneasily. One whispered by priests and elders, the other murmured by physicians with stained hands. In some villages, a doctor might explain putrefaction by day, while the same villagers sharpened stakes by night. Knowledge, after all, does not immediately comfort. Sometimes it destabilizes. To accept that the dead were not malevolent required more than evidence. It required trust. And trust comes slowly to those who have lived in terror. Medicine also forced a reckoning with something deeper. That the body, once animated by soul and intention, was now subject to impersonal forces. Bacteria had no morality. Decay followed rules, not grudges. The universe, it seemed, was colder than the old stories suggested. For many, this was no relief. Because monsters, at least, could be reasoned with. The psychological weight of this transition cannot be overstated. For centuries, fear of the undead had provided structure to grief, gave meaning to loss, transformed randomness into narrative. When a child died and the cows sickened, when famine followed a burial, when disease crept through a household after a funeral, myth offered causality. The dead were hungry. The dead were angry. The dead could be stopped. Medicine offered no such mercy. It explained, but it did not console. And so the old memories lingered. Even as pathology textbooks replaced grimoires, the cultural reflex remained. The word vampire survived long after its physical explanation was catalogued. Folklore outlived the conditions that birthed it. Stories were passed down not as fact, but as inheritance. Fear once learned does not require belief to endure. By the 19th century, medical journals openly mocked reports of revenants. Enlightenment thinkers declared the age of superstition over. The corpse was now an object, a specimen, a biological event. Death had been domesticated, sterilized by terminology. But something essential had been lost in translation. In reducing the dead to chemistry and collapse, medicine solved the mystery, but not the unease. Because the fear of the undead was never truly about bodies rising from graves. It was about watching something human become unrecognizable. It was about the horror of transformation without consent. About the slow betrayal of flesh. In that sense, the old myths were never wrong. They were symbolic truths mistaken for literal ones. The swelling corpse was frightening not because it moved, but because it reminded the living that identity does not survive the body intact. That love decays, that memory rots, that the face you knew will not remain loyal to you. Medicine could explain the process, but it could not soften it. And so, even now, when we understand decomposition down to the cellular level, we still avert our eyes. We seal the dead away. We perfume them. We preserve them. We build rituals not to stop monsters, but to protect ourselves from the knowledge that death is not instantaneous. It is gradual. It is intimate. It is transformative. The tomb has been illuminated. But illumination does not banish shadows. It merely reveals their shape. Knowledge arrived with its instruments and diagrams, its Latin precision and clinical calm. It named the gases, traced the pathways of blood, closed the case. Yet somewhere beneath that certainty, the old memory remains, of a time when the dead were not fully gone, when decay felt deliberate, when the grave seemed to listen. Medicine entered the tomb and spoke the truth. But the echo of fear was already carved into stone. And it still answers back softly, whenever we imagine the dead not as they were, but as they become. In the villages of old Europe, death was never silent. It creaked beneath floorboards, lingered in the corners of unlit rooms, and breathed through the soil of freshly turned graves. The earth itself seemed restless, as though it did not always agree with what it was asked to hold. Long before science learned to name decay, and long before medicine learned to promise certainty, people sensed a terrible truth. Death did not always behave as expected. This uncertainty was not philosophical. It was intimate. It slept in the same houses as the living. The Strigoi endured because it gave shape to that uncertainty. It was not born from superstition alone, but from observation, from patterns noticed in candlelight and fear, from bodies that changed in ways no priest or healer could explain. The dead sometimes bloated. Their lips darkened. Their nails appeared to grow. Blood seeped where blood should not be. And when sickness spread through a family after a burial, coincidence felt too thin a word to bear the weight of grief. To the medieval mind, death was not a fixed boundary. It was a threshold that sometimes failed. In Eastern Europe, where winters were long and the ground often frozen, the dead were not always buried quickly. Bodies lingered. Eyes clouded slowly. The line between sleep and death blurred in cold rooms where breath fogged the air. And when a loved one died suddenly, without confession or closure, something felt incomplete, as though the soul had been interrupted mid-sentence. The Strigoi lived in that interruption. It was said that some deaths were unstable. Those who died violently or too young, or burdened by unresolved sin were believed to carry a momentum that did not stop with the heart. The body became a vessel that had not learned stillness. The soul, untethered, hovered too close. And in this space between decay and departure, fear took form. This was not a monster that arrived from elsewhere. It emerged from the same soil that fed wheat and bone. The Strigoi was the embodiment of unfinished endings, a cultural answer to the unbearable idea that life might simply stop without meaning. In a world where illness struck without warning and children died before names could settle into memory, people needed a reason that did not feel random. The Strigoi transformed chaos into narrative. It suggested that something had gone wrong, not that nothing had mattered. And so the dead were watched. Graves were revisited. Bodies were exhumed. The living searched for signs that confirmed their dread. A mouth stained dark, a chest swollen with trapped gases mistaken for breath. Each discovery reinforced belief. Each burial became provisional. Death was no longer an event, but a process, one that could reverse itself under the wrong conditions. The Strigoi endured because it explained suffering without demanding acceptance. Where science was silent, myth spoke. But the myth did more than explain decay. It mirrored the emotional reality of grief. The dead did not leave cleanly. They returned in dreams. They echoed in empty chairs. Their absence pressed on the living like a presence. To imagine them wandering, restless, was not irrational. It was honest. Loss felt unfinished because it was unfinished. Grief does not end with burial. It lingers, feeds, consumes. The Strigoi was grief given anatomy. In communities where survival depended on cohesion, death carried social consequences. A single loss could unravel a household. A sickness could empty a village. When tragedy repeated itself, it demanded a cause that could be confronted. The Strigoi provided an enemy that could be named, hunted, and destroyed, restoring a sense of control in a world that offered little. Rituals followed. Iron was placed in coffins. Mouths were stuffed with earth or stones. Hearts were pierced not in cruelty, but in desperation. These acts were not barbaric to those who performed them. They were acts of maintenance, attempts to stabilize death itself. Because what terrified them most was not the corpse. It was the possibility that death could fail. The Strigoi also endured because it aligned with a deeper human fear. That identity might persist after morality dissolves. That a person could lose their humanity but keep their hunger. In this way, the Strigoi was not a ghost. It was a body without conscience. Life stripped of meaning, continuing only through appetite. This idea haunted societies bound by religious order. If the soul did not depart correctly, what became of salvation? If the dead could rise without judgment, then divine order itself was fragile. The Strigoi challenged the finality promised by faith, and so it was both feared and fiercely policed. Churches attempted to contain it. Scholars dismissed it. But belief persisted not because people were ignorant, rather because their experiences were unresolved. Plagues did not follow logic. Crops failed without warning. Entire families vanished between seasons. And each time death behaved unpredictably, the Strigoi returned to language, to memory, to fear. It endured because it was adaptable. As centuries passed and medicine advanced, the Strigoi did not disappear. Transformed, thinned. It refined itself into new shapes, into the vampire of later literature, elegant and distant, but still animated by the same core anxiety. What if death does not end us? What if something remains, hungry and unredeemed? Even today, this question survives in subtler forms. We speak of trauma that lingers. of cycles that refuse to break, of histories that will not stay buried. The language has changed, but the fear remains, that some endings are incomplete, and that the past can return with teeth. The Strigoi endured because it was never just about the dead. It was about the living, about their terror of uncertainty, their need for closure, their refusal to believe that existence could dissolve without consequence. Science would eventually explain the bloating, the bleeding, the illusions of movement in corpses. But explanation does not erase emotional truth. Knowledge can name the process, yet still fail to soothe the ache left behind. And so the Strigoi remains, not as a creature stalking forests, but as a shadow in the human imagination. A reminder that death has never felt entirely stable, that endings are not always clean, that what we bury does not always stay silent. In the end, the Strigoi survived not because people believed in monsters, but because they feared something far more unsettling. That death might not be final, that meaning might not be guaranteed, and that sometimes the grave is not an answer, only a pause. The earth appears still once it closes. A silence settles, thick as winter soil, and the living tell themselves that what is buried has learned to sleep. Yet for much of human history, the grave was never considered empty of intention. It was a threshold, a place where the dead did not always depart, but sometimes waited. In the villages of Eastern Europe, long after the last pagan fires dimmed and church bells claimed the sky, the Strigoi did not vanish, sank inward. It retreated from the fields and forests and took refuge in memory. No longer a figure clawing from the grave, it became something quieter and far more enduring. A story told softly, a warning passed down like an inherited scar. Because monsters do not need bodies to survive. They only need meaning. The Strigoi, in its final form, ceased to be a creature of blood and soil and became an explanation. When illness struck without pattern, when livestock withered overnight, when a child failed to wake, the cause could not be seen but it could be named. Somewhere beneath the earth, something unfinished still stirred. This belief did not emerge from ignorance alone. It was born in an age when death was intimate and relentless. Corpses were washed by family hands. Graves were shallow. Seasons of famine bloated bodies in unnatural ways. Gases tightened skin and darkened lips, making the dead appear flushed, even fed. Nails seemed to grow. Hair appeared thicker. The corpse, in its slow transformation, violated the expectation of peace. To those who lived beside such graves, decay looked like intention. The Strigoi lingered because it answered a question that had no comfort. Why does death sometimes refuse to stay contained? In older centuries, burial was not an act of closure. It was a negotiation. Iron was placed on chests. Mouths were sealed with stones. Bodies were bound, pinned, or turned face down, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that the dead might remember the way back. These were rituals shaped by anxiety, not malice. The living were not punishing the corpse. They were defending the fragile boundary between before and after. Yet as time passed, belief shifted. The Enlightenment brought medicine. The Church reinterpreted spirits as superstition. The Strigoi, once a physical threat, became a folkloric echo. No longer stalked villages. It survived in lullabies, cautionary tales, and whispered jokes told at dusk. But the idea never truly left. Because the Strigoi was never about the dead rising. It was about the living failing to understand death. At its core, the Strigoi embodied unresolved transformation. It was the anxiety of watching a human body change beyond recognition. It was grief made restless. A refusal to accept that someone loved could simply stop, without reason, without meaning, without return. Psychologically, the Strigoi stands where mourning collapses into fear. When loss arrives suddenly or violently, the mind searches for agency. It invents continuation. The dead are not gone, they are active. They watch. They hunger. They linger. In this way, the Strigoi mirrors a universal human impulse. Across cultures, the dead often remain aware. Ancestors observe. Spirits judge. ghosts wander. The grave is not an end. It is a door left slightly open, just wide enough for unease to breathe through. And so, even today, the grave still watches. Modern minds may reject the literal Strigoi, but its shape remains visible in subtler forms. In the way we fear abandoned cemeteries. In the discomfort stirred by exhumation. In the stories we tell about cursed places, unresolved deaths, and energies that refuse to dissipate. The language has changed, but the emotion has not. We speak now of trauma instead of spirits. Of memory instead of haunting. But the sensation is the same. The past does not always stay buried. Anthropologically, the Strigoi reveals how societies protect themselves from uncertainty. When death is unpredictable, belief becomes architecture. A structure built to contain fear. Naming the monster grants a sense of control. If something causes the suffering, then suffering is no longer random. Yet monsters born of misunderstanding carry a tragic weight. The Strigoi was often blamed on the vulnerable. The sick, the different, the socially isolated. Those who lived at the margins in life were suspected of refusing rest in death. Fear, once named, seeks a face. And too often it chooses one already marked. This is where the legend grows darkest. The Strigoi reminds us that belief can wound as deeply as it can protect. That in trying to guard ourselves from the unknown, we sometimes turn against one another. The grave became not only a site of mourning, but of accusation. A place where the living projected their terror onto those who could no longer defend themselves. And yet, the story endured, not because it was cruel but because it was human. The persistence of the Strigoi reveals something uncomfortable and enduring. Death does not frighten us because it ends life, but because it dissolves certainty. It strips away cause and effect. It leaves behind absence where presence once was. The mind, unable to tolerate that void, fills it with watchers. In folklore, the Strigoi never truly rests. It lingers near thresholds, crossroads, doorways, burial grounds, places where one state becomes another. This is no coincidence. Humans fear transitions more than destinations. The moment when something becomes something else. When the familiar turns foreign. The corpse is the most intimate transformation of all. And so the Strigoi survives. Not as a monster of claws and hunger, but as a symbol of what happens when understanding fails. When science has not yet arrived. When grief arrives too quickly. When meaning slips through our hands like soil. Today, no one expects the grave to open. No iron is laid on chests. No bodies are bound against return. But the unease remains. We still speak of closure. Of unfinished business. Of spirits who cannot move on. Because somewhere beneath our language, the old fear endures. That the dead may still be aware. That they may still remember us. That they may still be watching. In the end, the Strigoi teaches a quiet truth. Monsters are rarely born from malice. They emerge from confusion, sorrow, and the unbearable weight of not knowing. They are the shadows cast by unanswered questions. The grave does not watch because the dead hunger. It watches because the living do. For meaning. For certainty. For reassurance that nothing truly disappears. And as long as humanity fears what it cannot explain, the Strigoi will never fully rest. Not in soil, not in story, not in the deep interior of the mind where ancient myths still breathe. The earth may close. The bells may fade. But beneath the surface of memory, something remains awake. Not the dead, but